start the POIs and take them as best as possible. I'll submit timing reminders at 1, 6, and 7. So yeah, Prime Minister, when you're ready.
Perfect. Thank you. Checking if I'm audible first.
Yes, you are audible.
Can you give me 1 quick second, because I think my partner is calling me. I think he has a problem. Sorry. Nah. Really sorry about that. My partner had a small connection issue. I think he's back now, so I think I'm good to go. Sorry for that. Okay, so POIs, please, in the chat. Most likely, I'll take one at around 5 to 5:30 from closing if possible. So starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first thing we need to understand is what is the unique characteristic and unique difference between MINS and target-based regulation. We think that MINS regulation is the one in which the government has a higher control into the standards which are going to be implemented, in which the target one is one that you see that, yes, you have some general instruction about the goal that you should reach, but it's more up to the open market, to the actors, to determine how this goal is going to be achieved. Examples like that for MINS regulation could be setting a specific principle about how you could have equal representation of different actors within, let's say, a corporate environment, either it is minorities, gender, etc. Whether a goal and target type of, let's say, regulation is one that looks like you should have, for example, a quota of 10% women within the management positions. We think that the difference that exists is based on the way people operate and the decision making happening, whether this takes place from the government to set how this is going to be achieved, or leaving it up to the, say, corporations or actors to do it. We think that this model does not mean that we are only going to have a huge government that's going to tell you exactly what to do. We think there are going to be some form of target regulation as well, but we think we're going to put most of the emphasis on MINS regulation. 3 things in my case. First of all, why it is legitimate for the government to prioritize setting those specific standards. Second of all, why the say actors within the other environment are not good enough to setting the principles themselves. And third of all, how we're going to have more effective and inclusive policies by doing that. So why is the government the one that should be responsible for setting the standards? We think that the government is the one that holds the main responsibility into maintaining specific standards of levels of regulating the people and being able to provide for what they need. This can be seen analogous to the government being the one that sets the living standards, is the one for, pushing for equal rights. We think the reason why the government should be the one that making most deciding decisions, which means setting the standards, setting the ways to achieve the goal, is because it's the one that is more easy to hold accountable by the people about the ways that we're going to be achieving those measures. Why? Because it is the actor that is easy to be voted or voted out. It is the actor that has a direct responsibility to the people and their decision making. It is the actor that can be better controlled by what the public desires due to the idea of it being directly voted for them. We think that this is important because the government being able to set the means, so let's say setting the standards which the system is going to be based, is closer to what the people want compared to leaving the actors to do it by themselves. But why are, for example, corporations or other actors not good enough in doing it? So we think, first of all, because they don't necessarily always have the best incentives in mind. So when you give a corporation, let's say, an environmental regulation that tells you that you should be reaching, let's say, 10%, you should be minimizing your emissions by 10%, because they don't necessarily have in mind the best for the environment, for example, minimizing pollution, they're less likely to do measures that are going to be as effective. They're trying to find small windows within the regulation to go out of it. So for example, minimizing some form of emission, but having other forms of, let's say, of other forms of pollution, such as, for example, leaving the things that are producing within rivers, which means that the end result that you're going to have, the goal that you want to set, for example, minimizing environmental pollution, isn't going to be as well achieved because you're not going to have the best like incentive to achieve that. But even if we take the best case in which, like, let's say corporations have the best incentives to do the best and reach those goals with the best way, we think that many times they don't have enough capital, enough funds, and enough means in order to achieve it, which means they might not have the expertise or the know-how to do the correct steps in order to reach this goal, which makes this goal less likely to be achieved. We think that this looks like corporations that might have the best incentives into, let's say, trying to say, okay, I'll try to reduce my emission, I'll try to be like inclusive about, let's say, having women within the corporate setting, but at the same time, even if they're doing so, they're not actually solving the problem, because things within the organization, such as, for example, like other forms of pollution, or for example, not caring about like standards and like corporate like ethics within it, don't really apply. The difference is made when the government, like through a means regulation, puts a specific way to achieve a way to achieve a goal. So for example, we tell you that this is like the know-how you need, this is the way that this is going to be achieved. Like you should be able to do that by setting, for example, like a corporate, let's say, framework about like equal rights about different people, you're more likely to follow that. And why is that it? Because first of all, you're more likely to understand how that's going to be achieved, which means that you have like this smaller like bare minimum to entering this type of change, because you get the expertise of how to achieve it. Does closing a position have a question? Okay, I'll go.
The question of this debate is not who should be doing this. We agree our government should do this, but how should we do that?
Yes, but the difference is when you have a target type of regulation, which is what we should be defending, you leave up to like this rest of the actors the ability to decide how they're going to reach this goal, something which is not going to be as successful. Why I'm explaining now, because as I said, when you have the means, it is easier to follow this type of procedure because you get the know-how, you get more information about how you're going to do that. Second of all, because you feel higher pressure to follow it, because you have a specific framework that tells you that, look, you should have this means, this type of goal, this type of evaluation you should be doing. And thirdly, you're less likely to try to find like smaller like windows to jump out of like the target, or to make excuses about whether you were not able to set it. Because for example, if you have like a specific targets that tells you that you should minimize your emissions by 10%, you can easily say, I'm a small company, I don't have the ability to achieve that, I don't have the means. Whether you haven't, when you have, however, like a more generic regulation, you're more likely to have some like change because you have a more generic framework that you're going to move towards. So what have I told you? I told you that it is the responsibility of the government to cater for those problems in the best extent, why actors would not be efficient to do that to target goals, and why the target goals will not be efficient by themselves in achieving the result. For all those reasons, please vote for Ruchi.
The House would like to thank the Prime Minister Speaker for that fine speech, and now welcome the Leader for Opposition from side opening opposition. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, now. Clear targets provide enforcement to create the means that these companies or private people currently do not have. In my speech, I will going to explain you why we think that we have to specifically encourage things that go against the interest of countries or politicians or companies. And in my second point, I will talk about enforcement. Before that, I want to do one point of rebuttal about the meaning of means-based and target-based approach. So we think that both of these can apply to government. For example, in a question of green energy on a state level, it can apply to companies. For example, promoting people and putting people to leadership positions independent of their gender. It can even apply to private people. For example, if someone starts a diet, mean-based would mean I will do my best every day, and target-based would mean I want to lose 2 kilos per month. So we think that we are not talking about who enforces this. We are talking about what kind of approach we want to use. In most cases relevant to this debate, we think that both cases, it will come from the government, for example, enforcing emission of companies, or wheelchair access in universities or companies, with two different methods. With that, I want to move to my first point about why we think that we are talking about specific issues which are against the interest of these people. So these issues are not in the financial or personal interest of countries, of politicians, of companies. For example, a country doesn't want to reduce carbon emission because it's expensive, because the energy will be more expensive, and people don't want to re-elect a government if their electricity bills increase twofold in 4 years. I think that a workplace doesn't want to make it accessible because they don't want to spend the money on it, because how likely it is that they will actually have a wheelchair applicant. We think that it's very unlikely that someone actually wants to hire a black lawyer, because the leader of a company would probably be a rich, white, privileged man who never worked with a black person before, and anyway he can find enough good white applicants. So we want to enforce this thing despite the interest, despite the financial or personal interest of countries or companies. So we think that this makes the enforcement the most important issue in this debate. With that, I want to move to my second point about enforcement. We think that mean-based technologies and approach is very hard to enforce. To take the examples from the motion, banning polluting technologies will not anyhow work, because if you ban it completely, black to white, you just won't have a country the next day. If you want to make a workplace accessible, the company can say, well, we attempted it, but we ran out of money. We really tried to, but we actually have more pressing issues. A workplace can say that the reason we didn't hire black people is because all the best applicants were actually white, and you have no way to say, is it true or is it because of double standards? So it means that besides having a lack of incentive, these companies will have no enforcement and also no transparency, because it's really hard to assess if they did it because they really ran out of money, because they really didn't have good black applicants, or because just they didn't care enough to try hard. So to the second part of this point, why we think that target-based approaches are much easier to enforce. If you have a clear target to set, you either reached it or you didn't reach it. If you want to lose 2 kilos per month, either you lost it or you didn't lose it. And it's much easier to assess than if you did your personal best every single day in refusing another package of chips or chocolate. We think that it's much harder to get out of it because it has the transparency, because anyone can tell if you hired 2 black people every year or not. Everyone can tell if now a wheelchair person can actually get up to the second floor or not. So we think that this way would actually create the means. It would encourage the companies to create the means to reach a very clear target, and not allow them to say that, well, we tried, but we didn't actually have the means. So we think that the target-based approach is not black and white, so it makes it more realistic. So you can't say we cut emission right now, or you can't say we do our best to build this wheelchair access. We can set a reasonable goal, which is encouraged, because they will reach a target, and then they set the next target, and they can reach the next target, and this is something you can work for, and you have a goal in your mind that you want to reach. If we have quotas, we can increase the quotas stepwise throughout years, and this is much easier to accept. It's much easier to tell people, okay, you have to spend this amount of money every year to make wheelchair access in your building, and over 10 years you will have it, instead of saying right now you have to have it because this is the mean that we actually need. Or to say you have to start with hiring a black person every year, instead of saying that if you are not doing it, then you are a bad person, and you have to have like half. So we think that this is much more easier to accept to people, because you have to do it stepwise, and instead of doing it one by one. I can take a POI from closing.
Yeah, if you keep using banned technologies, or if you don't implement, for example, blind hiring, this is also still a visible policy. Please engage with the comparative of how both goals are actually reachable and what then the compliance means.
I'm not sure I understood that. My partner will answer that. Okay, So I want to go back to the point about why we think that target-based technologies can also be flexible. It can be flexible. We can modify them after a term. So, for example, the Paris Agreement, which they repeat after a few years, and they can set a stronger goal to the next term if they manage to reach the previous one. And this is always a reasonable target, and reasonable targets are encouraging. It can also mean that it can lead to a positive feedback when you once hired a Black woman because you had to, because you had no choice, but then you realize, well, this Black woman is actually the best worker I ever hired. So next time, even without quotas, you would be encouraged to hire more Black people. And you probably would never get to this point without actually having to do it, without having a target of one Black person per year. So we think that this enforcing can lead to the first step much better, much more effectively, and much more transparently. So with that, I explained you why we think that we have to specifically talk about things that are against the interest of countries and institutions, and why we need to enforce it, which is much easier for target-based approaches. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the Leader of Opposition Speaker for that fine speech. We'd now like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister from side opening government. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible? Because I'm having extremely lack of internet connection.
Yeah, no, you're clear.
Okay, if at any point I lag and you cannot hear me properly, can you like do a signal or like text me and then I close my camera, because I don't know what is happening today with my internet connection. Sorry, guys.
No problem, we'll do.
Great. In that case, I'm gonna start my speech. I'm starting my speech. 3, 2, 1, go. Note that OO never engages with the comparative and what Marianne is doing the debate. Therefore, I don't have any like material, and if they backload all their material in DLO when it comes to engaging with our case, in our principal case, in our like practical efficacy case, I think this is unfair engagement. I'm going to fairly address the best case scenario of opening opposition. The best case scenario for opening opposition is the following. Some companies don't have the capital and some companies don't have the opportunity to be able to enforce this kind of change. Therefore, this change can be inaccessible for these companies and they will dry out when it comes to not being able to apply these kind of changes. We say the following. One, we think this is a legitimate restriction when it comes to you have been the big government and intervening when it comes to the society, exactly because you need to care for the greater good and not for specific like companies, right? So at the end of the debate, we say the following. The comparative is the following. If you want to protect the environment, you have one policy, which is to say you need to cut when using this kind of technologies. This is the means-based technology. And the comparative and the counter proposal that opposition is actually defending is setting some type of let's say restrictions and setting some types of sanctions when you're actually using this kind of pollution, right? This then opens the window that if you have the capital and you have the opportunity to bear this kind of sanctions and bear this kind of quotas, you're going to use it and you're going to misuse this kind of mechanism in order to have the best quality and saving money or from actually going eco-friendly or saving more opportunity when it comes to having cheap labor, right? So at the end of the debate, we say the following. Opening opposition and closing opposition by the extent are contingent on explaining why the change, if you actually give them the right direction, is plausible to happen. And they need to explain the calculus and why most of the companies and most of the people in the society will actually be compliant to this kind of changes. But at the end of the debate, they also need to engage on the quality of change, right? So even if they manage to at some point explain why the change is likely to happen, they need to also engage the comparative what Margalena is telling you, that we have quality of change because we have check and balances and we have immediate try and error mechanism when it comes to as the government explaining and actually giving explicit reasons on what is the change and how monitoring what the change will actually be. So at the end of this like rebuttal, extremist rebuttal, what am I giving you? One, I'm giving you the legitimacy of this restriction. That is to say, in most cases in the society, governments tend to intervene when it comes to taxes, when it comes to having no labor, when it comes to minors, when it comes to not polluting the environment, exactly because you want to save money. We think this is a legitimate restriction, and this is why we need to prioritize. And as Magdalena is giving you in her framing, we're not saying that we're going to cut completely all targeted based like policy changes. If we have a specific problem and if we think that like the free market is capable of actually solving this problem, we might actually have these policies in outside the house too. But we're talking about the majority of the policies being changed and shifting and prioritizing means-based policy changes, right? So at the end of the debate, even if you don't buy, or when it comes to the efficacy metric, we say that the legitimacy of actually prioritizing and like enforcing yourself into the society in order to cater for the good, for the greater good, is something that is illegitimate and is something that is quote unquote utilitarian and something that you should be able to buy in from side proposition. Why is that? One, the government is something that you elect and it's something that represents you. Campaigns are around when it comes to policy change, when it comes to finance, when it comes to environment protection, etc., when it comes to low wages being shifted. So people give trust to you as a government for you to intervene and actually take responsibility and take accountability when it comes to you changing things. So at our side of the house, we have better accountability and more responsibility from the government on actually making these specific changes and actually enforcing this kind of changes when it comes to the quality and when it comes to the opportunity to save something from the society. But it's to say pollution, but it's to say having better like employment rates and having better like decreasing and reducing the gender pay gap. This is something that government should be contingent on. The government should not actually just like lead the way and let the free market do its own thing, because we don't trust the free market. And this is why we don't trust capitalism as a whole, right? Exactly because we don't think that they're actually contingent and that they have the best incentive and they have the best calculus when it comes to choosing what specific change needs to be addressed, right? So at the end of the debate, we say we have better accountability when it comes to forcing the government to make these kind of changes, having the necessary info and the type of explaining to the public, and having the best calculus when it comes to having the necessary technology or having the necessary like information when it comes to like calculating what is the best change and what is something affordable, quote unquote, for all companies in the spectrum of all employers, not just for big tech companies, but for everyone. So this is something that's going to be affordable as a policy, and this is why we think the government should be responsible for that, not some like vague free market veil that opposition is trying to defend. Before I go on, I will take CEO. Please engage.
Yes, so you have mentioned that since the government has been elected by and has representatives, they have the know-how on how to implement different regulations. But how do you explain the different actors which are involved in corporations and other civic society, which might not exactly function in the way which means-based regulation wants them to, but might be better explained by target-based regulations?
Yeah, so you were lagging, so I'm not quite sure what you're saying. I think that the question, like, can you repeat some of it, like the last part?
So you explained that the government would know better on how to get those targets met via means-based regulation because they have a better knowledge of that. But how would you explain?
Okay, I get the question. Two responses. First response: when the government is actually complicit and accountable for this change, you have a specific threshold that you need to meet. So you have a lower threshold that you need to meet. That is to say, you cut technology that pollutes the environment, or you have specific changes when it comes to quotas, when it comes to paying women, or when it comes to actually electing women in a CEO, let's say executive. When it comes to that specific change, you have a specific like context where you're going to make this change. This is more tangible and this is more self-evident, and this is why it's more likely to happen, exactly because you're enforcing it and exactly because you have a specific criterion where you're going to do that. Second of all, because like at the end of the debate, we say that we think the quality and the coherent change that we're going to make is far greater in our side of the house, exactly because we have someone that is accountable for that change, and we have someone that is elected and is legitimate on representing and actually imposing this kind of change, right? So at the end of the debate, we say the following. One, we think on intensity we win because we have a more efficient and more probable cause when it comes to changing things and actually like regulating stuff, when it comes to changing the site and like protecting someone who needs to be protected. Second of all, we have a more coherent change and we have a more accountable change, which is a legitimate claim when it comes to like forcing the government to take responsibility and take action and enforce itself throughout the society. We're proud to be on the right side of the debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech. We'd now like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the opening half of today's debate for us. Here.
Just a sec. I will set my timer. Meanwhile, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Ooh, okay, so if you have any POIs, please state them in the chat. I will try to take OG, and we will see how it goes then. Okay, so I'm starting my code in 3, 2, 1, now. At the beginning of the pandemic, a year ago, China, with their target-based regulations, was able to build hospitals in Wuhan for 10,000 people in a single month. On the other side, EU, with their like Europe in general, with their means-based policies, we should invest more in the healthcare. We should we should make the healthcare accessible, and we should improve the equipment in our hospitals, which we believe is the most important. Had the highest toll in the spring and in the summer, and the burnouts of healthcare workers in Italy, in Great Britain, in France, all over Europe. We believe that having clear targets is much more effective, and it's transparent, meaning both the public, both the people see that the government and the companies are reaching the target, and it's actually still beneficial for the companies. Unlike on the government side, and they prioritize the means. This is on direct clash with opening government, just notice that. So before I go to my point, why is it in the interest of the company, and how is it possible, feasible, and reachable, which is the POI from closing? Let me go into a few rebuttals. So what we are claiming is that if you have a clear target-based to-do list, you exactly state what you are going to achieve and when, it's very easy for everyone to follow if you have actually did what you promised. Meaning, in the government, if they say, this is our goal, we will reduce we will increase for example, wages, we will increase the dotation for healthcare, for blah, 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 for education. At the end of the government's period, the voters can go and check if the government has achieved what they promised. They can go like a checklist, meaning this is very transparent and very explaining to the public what the government did and what they didn't. On the other hand of the opening government, what they think is that if you have like a meaning, like a policy which should at some point improve education, you have no responsibility as the government to actually achieve. You can say, oh, we have tried this, but we failed. Oh, we have tried to implement these policies, but there actually wasn't any interest from the public. Meaning it makes it extremely inefficient, and they are not responsible for their actions because they stick to the rule. At the end of the day, what it means, they haven't achieved their goals, they haven't been held responsible for what they have done, and they can still go to be re-elected. For the people, this is both worst outcome. Perfect. So let me go into the transparency and what we are discussing here. If we have clear set up rules, if we have the target, it's easy to enforce, and from the governmental point of view, it's also easy to enforce on the companies, and they have fines, they have means of finance, like finance means to actually then check and punish if it wasn't achieved. Meaning it's much more controllable from the governmental point of view, which is also another point from the government, which they try to argue the other way around. And also it's very easy from the public to check. Let's go to my point. Why is it in the interest of company to have, or government to have target-based regulations? So besides the clashes which already was stated by my partner, it's easy for applicants to better evaluate their choices prior to applying for a job. it's better to know the deal before you start actually applying, and then save yourself time, save yourself rejections. Because if you have clear rules and clear goals, which the company is stating in front of you, because this is the target base, how to do that. And if they are aligned with your beliefs, you are more likely to go and work for the company much more efficient. How is it working? For example, if you work for a car company, which has agreed on reducing the CO2 emissions by this number by this year, you know that your job is to do that, and you will work hard on achieving this. If you know that there is like a general policy that we should reduce carbon emissions, and no one is like actually responsible, no one like, yeah, we are working on the solution, but it doesn't have to be. There is no deadline there; it has to be. You are not going to do your best, or you are not working under pressure to actually be there. Also, it is not really in your, like, you are not feeding back for yourself that you are actually doing what you plan to do. The same goes for teachers at the university, or like female teachers are trying to promote women in education. Like, they're trying their best, but if they don't see that there is some feedback backwards, which is pushing back like a positive feedback loop, which my partner explained, then they just don't fight as much as they would if they have a clear target that at least something will be fulfilled at the end of the year. What it means is that we get a better efficiency of the workers, which is better for the company or better for the public sector. And we also get a better moral of the people who are actually being in the workplace, which is in general, again, better for the people. So POI from OG now.
Even if you reach the goal, you don't necessarily have structural change, which means that the accountability that you create is false, because sure, you have 10 women in CEO positions, but they're not treated correctly.
So again, no. Why is it no? As we explained in the first speech, there is this so-called positive feedback. Yes, at the beginning, we totally agree with you. This can happen, that you get low efficiency because you just hire because of quotas. But what is happening, the people who got hired, they will have a better moral because they are knowing that now it's just on them and they have to progress. And there is a positive feedback loop coming from the firm, which suddenly sees that the quota is not useless and the worker is actually good and is more prone to hire workers of a similar background, right? Like the first thing. Second thing, we can still change this later on. It's not like there's this one target which never changes. As we do with all the laws, this is progressing in forward. So we can change it in, like, with the CO2 Paris Agreement. We can change it with any like, if the pandemic is over. Again, this is not really important because we are not stepping on any principle. What we have shown you? First of all, on the governmental metric, we are winning because we are telling you that the government actually is possible to hold responsible, meaning that the voters have their way out, and this is more efficient and more transparent than their means. Thank you.
I'd also like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition Speaker for that fine speech, and now welcome the Member of Government to begin the closing government side. Here.
Can I just check that I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, awesome. Give me 1 second.
Timer here.
Yeah, we'll just give on. Starting in 3, 2, 1, let's go. I'm going to talk about a couple of things in the speech, primarily focusing on compliance, adding crucially analyzing a group that hasn't been talked about much in this debate, namely consumers, and why they're the most important thing, probably in terms of actually changing corporate behavior, and secondly, and why I think we also just get more ambitious goals from those consumers. But first of all, I would just want to bring this debate down to reality a little bit. Note that the thing we hear from opening opposition is like, you have transparency because you can have the clear step goals, and therefore people will care. I am genuinely unsure, one, especially given the kind of issues we're talking about, things like climate change, things like literally forcing the largest corporations in the world that are like the biggest polluters or create the most harm for the people that live in our society, probably are already quite good at debating these kind of things or not following through on their promises. I'm unsure why fundamentally now this is something that they care about necessarily. Like specifically when the thing that they say is like, consumers will care when they see that you're not following your steps. If BP changes their CSR policy in terms of reaching, like, I don't know, a certain carbon emission like output or like a reduction in their carbon emissions by 2025 by 5 years, I'm genuinely unsure why the average consumer gives a shit or even knows about this. I genuinely don't know why anyone literally cares. Versus on the comparative, I think people probably care quite a lot at the point at which you use literally banned things or you break actual laws. Second thing, and this the second thing OO says is like, you can't, I think they can't just apply this debate to certain instances and say like, we have quotas on our side and you ban technology from one day to the next and that is fundamentally bad. I'm genuinely unsure why we can't also have good things on our side of the house. I think the incentives to pursue good policies still exist insofar as like specifically lobbying groups or just NGOs or pressure groups have incentives to lobby companies on either side. I think this pressure still exists. They never tell us why, like, meaning that we also have incentives for equal hiring policies. The thing that it looks like on our side is probably things like blind hiring. They probably have quotas. Unsure why quotas are inherently better. They never tell us. They can't just assert that that is true. So next then, let's actually move to why compliance is higher on our side of the house in terms of talking about consumers. Note that at the point at which you pursue means-based like regulation, you fundamentally can't virtue signal or do things like greenwash to the same extent that you can when you are target-based. Note that when you have a goal that is distant in the future, and that is something that also fundamentally probably no one else has achieved yet, or a very limited number of companies or limited number of entities have been able to achieve, then probably it is significantly easier for you to say in very fancy words or have nice PR campaigns or have nice shiny documents that say, oh, look, we are pushing towards this, and put a nice fucking like windmill on there and say, oh, we're being incredibly conscious about this. Note that that's a very easy way to present to consumers in a way that you can't do for the other thing. I think it is harder for you to do this at the point at which you can't just at the point at which you are specifically like pushing for something in the future that is further away. I think you cannot do this at the point at which you are actively having to comply with things that are happening in the now. Note that specifically this is the thing that looks probably worse for consumers. That is to say, it looks really bad for you if you use a polluting technology that is banned in your country. Note that also this is something that probably is significantly more visible to consumers at the point at which is probably also something that the media cares about more so than the 500 CSR policy about the things you're trying to do in the future or maybe will be achieving in the future, but have no clue of whether you're actually going to, because at the point at which you don't reach those goals, you can always just say like, oh, but we tried, but we didn't know because this is something that is fundamentally new and this is a miscalculation that we've made and now we've adjusted our goals and now we think these goals are significantly more realistic. Or also you specifically hold to like adjust your goals to the goals of the other people in the industry. Note that also there's probably incentives for companies to band together specifically at the point at which they're equally like polluting and do things that are like push for the same level of like regulation. And if all of them like agree that, oh, we couldn't reach this by this point, they can just say like, oh, look, these other people also couldn't reach it, therefore it is probably fine. I'm genuinely unsure why on their side of the house consumers give a fuck about those things at the point at which, one, I think it is significantly harder for them to understand and note that, oh, can't just say transparency and act as if that is necessarily equates like people carrying, people coming out and protest and people writing letters to their MPs and people literally saying like, oh, this is something that I care about and making it the priority of like a political campaign. Unsure why that happens and never give you reasons why. I think understanding the way in which specifically those goals aren't being met or whether it is legitimate whether those goals are being met is harder for consumers to understand. I think it takes a lot of time for them to be able to actually process. Secondly, I think it's just less visible, like the average person doesn't give a shit or reads at the point at which they go to the shop and decide which thing to buy, versus I think it's significantly easier to understand when a company breaking a law and when the media attacks that company and says it is incredibly fucked up that that company is using X polluting technology or is using this thing that is fundamentally banned in this country, then I'm unsure but that is I think that's probably something that is significantly more likely going to make consumers stop consuming that particular product. Note that this is the most important in terms of compliance insofar as consumer boycotts hurt you the most in the long term in terms of reputation as a company, but also in the short term. On the comparative, I think regulation is something you're significantly more likely going to want to comply given that it hurts you less. But even if you say companies are still horrible and they don't want to comply, at the point at which consumers keep consuming, that is still something they're willing to take because they can keep paying those fines as long as people simply buy their products. And people stop buying their products, it's more likely going to happen on our side of the house, then that is the thing that hurts them more. Secondly, note that I think on our side of the house, they can't just pay a fine. Note that there is also still a time window on our side, right? Insofar as like you probably still have annual reviews to see whether people are complying with the means-based regulation that we are talking about. Probably means that they can do things like take away your business permit. I think that's probably a pretty good incentive for you to want to comply with those things as opposed to like the thing that you can always push it back into the future. Thirdly, I think we also get better international compliance insofar as if something is target-based, I think it is harder to hold specific countries accountable. That is for how they react, right? As in, like you can say like, oh, it's a 25-year goal. I think it's quite easy to blame this kind of stuff on other factors and say like, oh, but we're less wealthy, or oh, we have political instability, or oh, we are at different stages of development, versus only comparative. I think at the point at which someone is using like a banned technology, then you can simply say like, oh, we're going to stop trading with you. I think that's probably a pretty good incentive to have a larger group of people like have that kind of compliance. I think if countries have like like overarching like incentives, that probably also makes it better to actually hold large companies that operate on a multinational level accountable on our side of the house. We think that is probably most important given that they hold the largest amount of power. I'll take opening quickly.
Because companies know best the means and ways how to achieve goals, you have to set the goals for them and let them select the best means for them. If you enforce those means, they will be, by definition, less effective in achieving them.
Unsure what exactly this means. I think probably like we just tell them the kind of goals they have to meet. I don't think that the comparatives that we tell them the goals to meet. I think the comparatives that they set the goals that they want to choose. Unsure what that was about. Secondly, then why the actual goals for us better on our side as well, right? Because know that even if compliance is symmetric, I think we still have better goals and better ambition overall. One, I think just like target based is oftentimes long term. I think that means that it's fundamentally oftentimes like intuitively oppositional to the kind of interest that companies hold. Insofar as it means it's too high of a commitment you have to make. Now, this is particularly unpopular when you have things like changing CEOs, when you have things like market fluctuations, when you have things like shareholders that you need to specifically satisfy in the short term. Long term goals aren't something that you oftentimes push for. Second thing, I think it's important that politicians note that they don't just want to, it's not just like OG says about electability, but it's specifically that they want to care about, that they have to present those goals in the short term, because otherwise they have to it's very easy to push it off into just the next politician and say like, oh, but they have to now care about this, as opposed to like specifically presenting a plan that is ambitious and is yours and is actually standing out in terms of that, versus just blaming it on the next government that is elected. Lastly, then in terms of lobbying, note that I think at the point at which you have a clear fixed cost, I think companies lobby less against it because it is more easy for them to implement, versus at the point at which you're unsure what the cost is and you're unsure specifically how to do this because no one else has done it, and probably you do this less on our side of the house. For all of those reasons, close the government.
Thank you so much to the member of government speaker for that fine speech. We're now going to call upon the member of opposition to begin the closing opposition's case. Here.
Okay, I'll start speaking in 3, 2, 1. So when we come to measuring the entire application of the target-based measure versus mean-based measures, the closing government, the main argument they have is they rebut the transparency argument of the opening opposition by saying that consumers will not inherently be able to understand and give the transparency and accountability required by enacting these measures, because they will be explained away by the corporation, saying that specific quota which was set was flawed, and that's why we couldn't meet it, and that's why the consumers will not be able to hold the corporations accountable. My point of contention with that is, when we do hold the corporations, first of all, consumers will hold the corporations accountable, because if it comes to problems like CO2 emissions, they will be directly impacted. And we believe that by giving a set quota, they have a certain standard by which they can actually hold a corporation or different entities which are involved are more accountable. Because otherwise, if you have a means-based, you might have better, have more accommodating views. But the thing is, it still doesn't give you a metric for measurement which is required. And like we see, and in this situation, consumers were apparently the only actors which were considered. The other actors we have to consider in this debate are also the international community and other non-governmental organizations and other things which are also part of movements like this which want to enact change. So what happens when you give target-based? So like if you are in an international community, for example, if you are in a part of the Paris Climate Agreement, they have a certain number of the target they have to reach and reducing carbon emissions and reducing global temperatures. So that is a set target. So the only way, so that is what the measure is by which normal citizens are able to identify if the goal is met and identify if what they thought is the government is actually holding themselves accountable and doing the right things and holding corporations accountable to get their goals met. What happens otherwise, if you have weighing against the means-based, is that there are lots of ways of subjectivity, because the corporations, like was mentioned by the closing government itself, with the closing government mentioned that there might be subjectivity if you have target-based, but actually the subjectiveness is more present if you have means-based regulations, because then it's just an overarching structure you're giving instead of giving on target-based. Another thing which was mentioned by the opening government was that our entire debate rests on the contention of whether we can prove that the targets we're giving will be achieved and whether people will be complying with them. So I believe that if we have target-based measures, many corporations, when it comes to corporations, they might they might have an inherent incentive to enact these measures, but they might not have the know-how to do this. And so what happens is, if you give them a target, they might they might have a mechanism by which they enact measures which will reach that target. Otherwise, what happens if you give them means-based measures and means-based regulations is that although they might have a rough idea of where to go, they might not have a direct mechanism on how to reach that goal. So they might actually do more harm than good without even their intentions. And this is just as on the assumption that these corporations have good intentions. Like the opening government said, that these corporations already have incentives to best incentives and want to actually have diversity and want to reduce, but that incentive has no reason and there is no proof for that incentive, because corporations might not even have that incentive in the first place, and they might because of the gray area and subjectivity we have regarding means-based regulations, they might just say, okay, yeah, we tried our best, but we didn't, and they might just get let off the hook. On the other hand, the government, the opening opposition also said that when you have, opening government also said that when you have specific standards of regulations, then that means-based regulations gives you more specific standard of regulation, and that gives a direct responsibility. But however, that analysis was not made true because they did not involve the other actors in the debate, and they also only talked about the consumer angle of it. Yes, I will take the government from the POI from the opening government.
You're defending the wrong side of this debate. We say we don't trust the companies, and this is why we need to enforce this kind of change. You say you agree with us, and we say you have better responsibility, therefore it is a legitimate restriction, and it's something that is more tangible and more probable to happen. Please engage on the comparative.
Can you please repeat your point? You contradicted yourself a lot, I think.
Yeah, so if you consider the fact that companies are unreliant and this incentive is something that is not entirely certain, then you consider the fact that this is improbable to happen, and this is why our legitimate restriction is something that is more probable and more tangible as a change and equality.
Okay, so you have said that because they're not inherently likely to want to do this, they will not comply with target base. But you have not given a measure or impact as to why the means based they would actually be more compliant with that. You roughly touched upon this when you talked about the companies not having, if you have target based measures, they might not have the capital or the resources to do this. But I think, as the opening government also mentioned a lot on the veracity of the government, since they have been elected, they know the best. So if that is true, coming by your own principles and your own frame of logic, if they have inherently have a good knowledge, they will also adjust their targets based on the sizes of a corporation, based on the sizes of the scale they want to reach. So it's not that they will have a blind target about, okay, we don't care how much money you have, how much capital you have, we would just want this done. I don't think that's how it would work. Going by the argument made by the government itself, that they know they've been elected by representations and they will have a more better way of explaining and giving a structure, which is means-based. However, that doesn't explain why you can't include more personalized measures even when you do target-based, and why that can't be subject to taken in different viewpoints even when it's target-based. Just because it's target-based, there's a misconception that you have to reach this. But however, when you actually formulate a policy in government, then in parliament, then there's a lot of caveats to it, and there are many different avenues you can attack, and many different things which are exceptions, many different things, and there's a thing on how to actually reach the target. So the main burden actually in this debate will fall on the impact. So although the government side has argued that because the people might not have more capital, because the consumers might not be a good actor, which will ensure transparency, they have not talked about the impacts which actually will be had at the end of it. They've only talked about whether that mechanism will be adopted, but whether or not that means-based regulation will have the right impact, that is not guaranteed when you have means-based regulation. That is only guaranteed when you have target-based regulation. Hence, I write up my speech.
Thank you so much to the member of opposition speaker for that fine speech. We're now going to welcome the government group speaker to conclude not only the closing government, but indeed the government bench. Here.
Mm-hmm. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. One sec. I need to organize my papers real quick. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Two clashes in the speech. Firstly on compliance, secondly on better goals. I think that on either side, if we win either of those goals, I think we're already winning this debate, because you can't, even if like opposition wins on the compliance point, if they have really bad goals that they're trying to achieve, they have no effectiveness on their side. So both goals are equally important and can equally be won. I'm going to engage with all teams in under those points, and especially given that most of CO analysis is very derivative from opening opposition, that will just be integrated. Firstly, talking about compliance. What opening government tells you about compliance is that, look, companies do the bare minimum, so they are ineffective. What they're missing is that they're never providing you any mechanization on why you're able to enforce better on our side of the house, on how you're able to get compliance on our side. This is the thing that Vicky does on 3 levels. Firstly, on the government level, secondly, on an international level, and thirdly, on the consumer level. I think that those 3 levels are the best mechanization you have heard in this debate on why we get compliance. The opposition case, so like, we have accountability, is only working on the government level because they're never able to prove to you why the average person is actually able to go and see how each individual country is doing with when they are, whether they are complying with the Paris Climate Agreement or not. That is very hard to reach statistics, and never tells me why that's publicly available. Versus on the comparative on our side, Vicky tells you that the strongest mechanism is actually that consumers are actually able to see whether you are complying with a very specific law that has been implemented or not. I.e., if BP is still using a very forbidden like type of technology, that is something that is a lot more visible than whether they have achieved their climate targets in 10 years. I think that is the comparative that CO never engages with. The only thing they try to respond to that is that they're not quite sure whether consumers are a good actor that you can like rely on for that. I think that the entire op bench just tried to be reliant on consumers understanding whether this is a regulation you are in compliance with / voters understanding it. So they themselves are also reliant on it. But secondly, I would say that in like governments that are able to pass, for example, climate change policy, already have voters that do care about climate change. Otherwise, you'd never be able to pass it. At that point, I think our analysis on that like consumers / voters care about these types of issues still stands. What is the stuff that like opposition bench or mainly OO tells you? Firstly tells you that like you're able to tell if you're meeting the goal or not better if you have things like targets. I'm genuinely unclear how this is in any type of way symmetric, and that is the comparative, that is the POI I gave to them about like whether this is something that is symmetric. I think it's still visible if the regulation like exists or not. Secondly, I think that it's significantly harder to check all of those promises and like compare what the government promised to you and go look up the statistics at the end of their term. Like that is the thing, that is literally the comparative. They themselves tell you, I'm not making this up. Versus the comparative, you see whether a government, like it's publicly announced that they are passing a law that bans a specific technology. I think that is significantly like smaller of a burden for an average voter to engage with. Lastly, Vicky tells you how we have the additional mechanism of consumer accountability. Lastly, I think that it's really important to understand that lots of the goals that they're protecting are very long term. The Paris Climate Agreement is literally 25 years. I'm unsure how any of their accountability works in the first 24 years of that time frame, given that the goal only has to be reached by 25 years, and all of the companies can just say, look, we're doing this later down in line. Right now, we're not in a hurry to actually meet that type of goal. So any of their accountability claims only work at the point at which the target has to be reached and not in those 25 previous years. I think at that point, they lose all effectiveness. The second thing they tell you is that like, we're able to modify goals, and that is a good thing. Unclear if it's actually good. At a point at which you're able to modify the Paris Climate Agreement, that creates uncertainty and a feeling that like generally the regulations might change. I think that creates a significantly higher incentive for companies to actually go and be like, maybe we don't even need to fulfill this, or we're in no rush to do it, so they don't get any of their compliance. But secondly, this is uncomparative. On our side, once like a law has been passed that you need to do XYZ thing, and that has been effective, you can just pass another law. Why is that comparative? Last thing the entire op bench tells you is like, sorry, we couldn't reach. I think that like that is significantly more possible if you have a long-term goal that you need to reach, because it is a lot easier for a company CEO to go like, look, sorry, the CEO 10 years ago was the one that didn't start implementing this policy. I was only the CEO for the last 2 years. I had absolutely nothing I could do in this time frame, and that is why we didn't reach the type of regulation that the government told you. Versus on the comparative, if you have a 1-year time frame to implement the very specific regulation, or i.e. stop using a specific regulation, then in that time frame the CEOs don't change. The accountability is directly to that one person, and they cannot like blame past administrations. This also like works on a government level. Last thing they say is like, not allowing companies to choose the type of means that they want to go through is something that is more ineffective. I think that is just generally dependent on the incentive of companies to be effective, that opening opposition never proves to you. So that mechanization doesn't stand. But secondly, there is still effectiveness on the competition to provide best alternatives to ban solutions on our side. I think that's a clash that we're just generally winning on compliance. Second clash on better goals, and I think that this is also crucial, and most of the op bench just never never deals with this. Before we talk about that, if opening opposition has a POI. No, okay.
Yes. Any long-term agreement, including the Paris Climate Agreement, has intermittent goals that you have to reach every 2 years and every 4 years.
Brilliant. Okay, every 5 years, every 2 years. I think that just the comparative is that, like, no, one, you cannot fiat that all of them have it, but two, I think that it's just general that we have better goals. That's the second clash I'm analyzing. Fine to take that comparative. Opening government tells on better goals that it's easier to hold politicians accountable for because there is like the enforcement mechanization, but they never make a comparative with the target-based goals that you have. That is crucially the link that Vicky provides to you on what is the comparative between short-term and long-term incentives of the politicians, and why we crucially have it only on our side of the house, and why you never have it on long-term, where you can blame future administrations, or it's a political win that you never get to claim if the 25-year goal is actually reached by a different administration. The second thing opening government tells you is that politicians have a know-how to do well, but they never analyze why that's true. Vicky gives you the comparative on how you're able, or how you're always going to be lobbied by NGOs and experts, and why you have that knowledge. Lastly, I think that opening opposition never engages why good goals get actually passed, so they have no effectiveness whatsoever. Vicky gives the comparative on the short versus long-term incentives, and secondly, on the lobbying comparative as to why we have less lobbying, because like companies are able to predict how much money they need to put in, thus the regulations that are going to come actually hurt you less. CEO says that but this these types of things have no impact. Vicky actually gives you reasons why politicians have a short-term incentive to pass a legislation that is meaningfully good, because that is a thing that reflects on them on the next type of election cycle. So I think that all of the solutions you are trying to pass are actually good. CEO never analyzes it further, so there is no claim there. The last thing that the entire op bench tries to do is target goals are better, and then they give an example about it. I think it's quite easy to flip those types of examples. For example, blind hiring is significantly better than the feelings of the minorities compared to having quotas. One, they feel like they're there because of their qualifications, not because there's a quota to fill. Secondly, other employees in the company take them seriously because they think they're there because of qualifications. And thirdly, I think they also act as role models. Unclear where OO was going with that. Leaving it up to companies is significantly worse than governments deciding who have been lobbied by NGOs and experts and are passing the best goals. On that comparative, one, we have the best goals, even if it takes meaningfully less time, more time to achieve them. They're just better, but we overall have more compliance. CG wins.
I'd also like to thank the government whip speaker for that fine speech, and now welcome the opposition whip speaker to conclude not only the closing opposition, but indeed the debate. Here.
Thank you. Okay, so as closing opposition, we have to always remember who is the final receivers of any impacts of the regulations. And in this case, we have to think first of all of the society within the consumers, or any members of society in any point will be benefiting from means-based production or from target-based production. So what we want to ensure is that any kind of regulation has a positive impact on these people, and that this impact can be measurable, be guaranteed to have been succeeded or not. And we will prove in this speech that it's only possible if we have target-based production as opposed to mean-based production. So a few things to rebuttal on closing government sites. First of all, a lot of talk has been done about how the consumers do not genuinely care about what kind of numbers or quotas you throw in their face. And we agree that, okay, on some certain level, it's easier to engage with people when you give them these fancy words and this really nice statements about, oh, we will have accessible government one day, we will have accessible workplace. You as a Black individual, as a minority, as an LGBT member, you will have a workplace which will be great for you. However, there is no plausible result, there is no actual consequence of this act, of this vague, empty statement. Then a person who first falls for this empty statements, empty promises, he will not have any real impact on his or her life, as opposed to when with target-based production, we have a certain quota, a certain pressure imposed on this corporation, which did not hire a certain number of gay people or Black people or any minority. And then society can literally say, any government can impose the pressure on this corporation saying, you did not achieve this target. And in this case, corporation will be pressured to actually have real and accountable impact, as opposed to, as a Black individual, as a minority, which I, in a way, I would rather have an actual workplace as a result of a target-based quota than an empty promise of one day I'll have an accessible government. And this can be applied to any sort of environmental policies, any sort of regulation. If you talk about CEO, we can assume that majority of people do not have enough information, are not maybe knowledgeable enough on the matter of the climate change. In this case, we have to rely on specialists within the government, on climate scientists to define clear targets on how can we prevent climate change, on how can we reduce CO emissions. And I think that closing government made a case of, I don't fucking care where the windmill will be put. Well, I do care, because as a result of the windmill, 10 windmills being put by a certain year, I will have I will be closer to achieving renewable energy air will be cleaner, and I will, as a consumer, as a citizen who doesn't have general knowledge on the topic, I will still feel the impact of this target-based regulation, as opposed to government just saying, oh, we are working on CO2 emissions. And as an average citizen who might not have enough knowledge, I will not know whether that is true. I might even live my whole life thinking, oh, my government is great because they are doing all these amazing things, but there's no way to keep them accountable. So what we want to prove is that, first of all, the closing government has said that the data is not transparent and unavailable. Well, that is just not true, is it? Because we can access, because any decent government, and we want for most government to eventually be decent, does publish statistics. They do have open data sources because we want to hold them accountable. And we see examples of governments do being held accountable when they publish data on any regulations they did or did not achieve. So what we're saying here is that once a certain target is set in a quantifiable manner, there is a really clear way to measure whether it has been achieved. And what's the consequence of that for society, for people, and for governments? So if a certain government, corporation, CEO set a clearly defined positive goal, and those goals can be still positive, people can still engage with them. So if you tell me that as a worker, I'll have a more accessible workplace environment, and then you also tell me that we will hire 10 people every week, for instance, as a random number, I would still engage with this goal because it would still impact me directly. And on top of that, if this government or anything does not achieve the goal, we will have a really clearly defined pressure mechanism to say you did not achieve this goal. And in this case, the government which gets re-elected as a result of a failure of the goals, a new government which comes into place will learn from the mistakes, because every government at the end of the day wants to keep in power. So the governments would come into place of a failed government, they will know this time we have to actually comply with all this target-based means, as opposed to this like vague statements about this mean-based regulation of how new government can come into place of old government, and they can just say to the public, oh, we're doing this better, we're making them more accessible things, we're giving you more seed, we're giving you more clean air. And as an average person who doesn't have access to all this, like, I don't know, behind facade, you don't know whether it's actually true, do you? And even assuming that people are engaged, that people love the government, which is in fact bullshit and doesn't actually provide any adequate and measurable result. So what else do I want to say on the opening government side? Opening government made a lot of really vague points about how the government, it knows best, and it does. So it can do certain things better. Well, we do agree in certain cases government do know best, they have more funding. What we don't understand is how is it impossible for government to get involved in target-based production? Because target-based production does not exclude the government, it doesn't only restrict itself to corporations. PIOG, please.
I'll note that CG never weighs explicitly their case with us, and even if you buy the extension, beside washing the class of consumer when it comes to mechanizing the know-how of the government, they are explicit and they are contingent on the framing, on the legitimacy and the accountability we bring as OG, and they need to weigh that in order to win this debate. CEO also never engages with the principal case that we bring. Please engage.
Sorry. I didn't engage with principal case you bring. Maybe I misunderstood something. Could you like maybe summarize it in a manner? So basically what I said is against like opening government, as against your case, what my whole argument was is that you have said the government knows best, corporations have certain incentives, which is not always beneficial. Well, this is, even it's generally true, how does mean-based production by any means prevent governments from like prevent corporations from still kind of like messing up with their agendas, which brings us to really to a point which we can build up on with opening opposition, which is that it's potentially it's white men deciding what accessible in a workplace, what accessible workplace means. So what accessible is for one person and for another are not the same thing at all. So what we want to ensure with target-based production is that with numbers, at least there's a clearly defined normalized standard to which all organizations, all governments will comply, and to which people will actually see results on their lives. And as, again, bringing back the point of the subjectivity that kind of like points around the topic. So this kind of like anything can be spun around. We live in a world where like any statement can be put in 10,000 different ways. So in order for there to be actual success of any kind of mean-based policy, you have to first ensure that everyone agrees on what accessible means, that everyone has the same opinion about what this amazing empty goal would be, and that as a result, also magically government so happens to actually achieve it. Then it would be amazing. I would love to live in a world where we all have the same idea of a certain like positive outcome of a certain thing. However, we do live in an equitable society where certain people are going to be losers in this like in this game of what's accessible, what's not, what is climate change compliant, what's not, what's environmentally beneficial or what's not. Because again, we have to keep in mind most people not have enough knowledge on certain topics to actually understand what's happening with mean-based targets. So at the end of the day, we were saying that if the actual final goal of this debate is to have real positive outcomes which are good for society, which will pressure governments to do better, pressure corporations to do better, as a result of which we will all have a better world, it's target-based reduction. Thank you. Regulation.
Thank you so much to the opposition group speaker for that fine speech. I would like to invite you all to digitally cross the floor and shake hands. And then I think you can leave the breakout room and head back to the main room. We will deliberate and then call you back after about 15 minutes. So again, thank you for a lovely debate. Yeah, we will now deliberate and get back to you with the call.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Results? Thank you. Okay, whatever.
Ocom, could I just get a confirmation that you're done recording? Panel, if you wouldn't mind just taking 2 minutes or so to come to your initial call, and then we'll begin our discussion.